Welcome back to the Fantasy Formula with Adam and Rob, and on this episode, we'll get your F1 fantasy teams ready for one of the most iconic races of the year at Monaco. Rob, we're starting this week with very different teams, but we all seem to survive at Imola.
Yeah, I mean, it depends on what your definition of survival is. I think it wasn't by any means a golf in points, but the fact that you and I own the only driver that DNF'd in the race probably set us apart from those that didn't have Alex Albon. But it was, as you say, a weekend that delivered quite a few surprises, and I fully expect with these different lineups heading into Monaco, we could have another weekend where our teams are again slightly different.
We're shaking up the deck with tonight's show. We're going to start right away with the winners and losers from Imola. My first winner this week was Lando Norris, and this is the second week in a row I've got Lando in this spot. He shaved Verstappen's race lead from 7.5 seconds to zero point 0.7 seconds in the last 20 laps to make this a real race to remember. And he was the highest scoring fantasy driver with 37 points thanks to his third straight podium of the year, his third straight podium at Imola, and his third straight driver of the day win. So if Lando continues to compete for race wins, consistently pick up that driver of the day, I think he could be the best driver in the game coming up. And for those teams like Will Buxton that invested that 2x DRS boost on Lando, they really paid off. My second winner this week is Lance Stroll. This was his 150th Grand Prix start and finished P9. He had a grid-leading 6 overtakes, which continues to keep him on top of all other drivers in the category of overtakes and make him a great midfield driver. He had 12 fantasy points and a tiny little 0.5 million price gain, so another great week for Stroll in both categories. And I know it's a topsy-turvy year for Lance, but if he continues to stay on the grid, he'll be turning out some really good fantasy points for you week in and week out. Rob, who are your two winners?
I had Max Verstappen as my first one, and we made the point last week when we had him in the winners category as not typically a driver that when he finishes P2 consider a win, but I think fantasy-wise just continue to demonstrate his consistency as one of the most reliable drivers and fantasy assets to own. He came away with 35 points, a couple shy of Lando Norris's 37, but I'm just continually impressed by his performance to get an ability to get out as much from that car as possible, especially in qualifying where in the lead up to that, it just didn't look like they'd be quite as competitive as Ferrari and McLaren from what we'd seen in free practice on Friday and Saturday. But he just continued to tick along. And yes, the gap to Red Bull looks to have closed a lot over these last few weeks, but Max in my eyes continues to be that kind of beacon of consistency that we've come to know and love from him as one of our fantasy assets. So a great result for him. I fully expect that heading into Monaco, he's on for his 8th pole position in a row. My other winner was the McLaren constructor, and they came away with 64 points, which was their best result of the season, all things considered. I fully expected something like this to transpire, and with those thoughts in the back of my mind with these recent upgrades in Miami and Oscar's second half of his package in Imola, definitely thought that they were going to be the best chance of taking the win away from Max Verstappen. And Lando got awfully close. It came down to less than a second on that last lap. But they definitely demonstrated their I guess, upside as a fantasy asset with a 0.3 million increase and 64 points, as I said. But I think if it wasn't for Oscar's grid penalty on the Saturday, I definitely thought that they'd probably have a few more points in their pocket come the end. But 64 points, not a bad result for their owners. And as the lowest owned constructor among Red Bull, Ferrari, and McLaren, I definitely think they're going to be a handsome differential in the weeks ahead. To the contrary, though, Adam, give me your losers.
My first loser was Fernando Alonso, and Aston Martin really sacrificed him to get Stroll that P9 finish. So he started from the pit lane because he had a different setup to his teammate. They needed to make some changes after Saturday, so he started P20. He pitted early to provoke the drivers around Stroll to pit early, which allowed Lance to make some late overtakes and get that P9 finish. Only the second P19 of Alonso's illustrious career, so a rare finish for him. And he only scored 2 fantasy points last week, which is the fewest in a race that he didn't DNF since Monza of 2023. So a brutal result for some of those teams that were running the Sainz-Alonso pairing with the hope of some price gains. Fernando didn't really deliver for us there. The other loser for me this week was Sergio Perez. He qualified P11, which cost the Red Bull constructor 5 of those teamwork bonus points, so that was a disappointment there. He only climbed up to P8 and scored 11 fantasy points, which is a disappointment for a guy we're hoping to deliver the 2x DRS boost spot. Checo was making that strong push in the middle of the race, but he had a brutal run into the gravel that cost him 5 seconds and then really just took his race out. This is the exact race last season where Checo lost his qualifying form and was consistently out before Q3, and I worry that he started a really unfortunate tradition. So I'm nervous about Checo moving forward.
Yeah, his European kind of concerns are certainly allayed after the first one in Italy. So I'm not so sure what to expect from him moving forward.
Rob, you've got a very uniform pair of losers over there. Tell me about the Williams.
Yeah, not a great weekend across the board fantasy-wise for Alex Albon and Logan Sargent. Albon had his second DNF of the campaign, and he just looked horribly off the pace throughout that entire Grand Prix. 4 pit stops, which was absolutely diabolical. One of them, I don't believe the tyre was even screwed on properly. So the fact that after the second pit stop, it looked like his race was over entirely made me worry that something like an early retirement was inevitable, and that proved to be the case. Just not a great result for him, and one of the only drivers, I think Stroll may be the other, if I'm not mistaken, as to have 2 DNFs through, or Ricardo as well, the other one, to have 2 DNFs through 7 races. So not a great omen for a driver that seems to be struggling a lot more this season. The Williams just doesn't seem to have the race pace. And Logan Sargent seems to have been a product of that failure as well. He came away with -2 and just looked like a non-factor through that entire weekend. He's not classified on the Saturday for not setting a representative lap time in qualifying, was also not exactly welcome for his owners, and there's just been nothing to suggest that he's a consistent fantasy asset moving forward. So he has had his peaks of 9, 8, and 7 throughout the season, but also had his troughs of -2, -7, and 0. Those minus scores coming in back-to-back weekends. So not a great result for Logan, and I guess the rumors continue to swell around whether or not he'll be replaced before the end of the year.
That disappointment when Logan didn't classify in qualifying was definitely clear in his radio message for sure. Let's move on now to our 5th Gear Garms giveaway, because this is about a man that's had some bad luck at the race we're coming up to this weekend. The question is, will Charles Leclerc beat his best ever Monaco finish, which is P4? And for anyone who doesn't know the history here, Charles DNF'd his first home race back in 2018. In 2019, he got a bad qualifying strategy and he started the race P16. 2021, he qualified on pole, crashed in Q3, and Ferrari couldn't revive the car, so he DNF'd on Sunday. In 2022, he was on the pole again, but Ferrari double-boxed Leclerc and Sainz, and that cost him the race. And then last year, he took an impeding penalty on Lando Norris and never quite stood a chance for the podium. So difficult stretch for Charles in his home race. Rob, do you think he's going to do better than P4 this week?
Yeah, I'd like to think so. I kind of went into the weekend last year with the same point of view, and you just can't seem to predict those impeding penalties. But he has qualified P2 on 3 separate occasions this season, and the Ferrari upgrades certainly have delivered. He's got a new race engineer in Imola that we saw in Brian Bozzi, and I think all of the signs are pointing towards a Leclerc win at some point in the season. I'd love to see it at his home Grand Prix. I definitely think he will beat P4, whether or not a win's another thing altogether, but I definitely think he's on track for a podium at his home Grand Prix.
To enter this contest, head on over to the FanAmp app and join the fantasy formula base to enter for your chance to win. All right, let's head down to our Monaco hit list, and I want to start with the most popular assets from last week with McLaren. You can see on the screen here, this is the median lap times from Imola, and Lando was in the thick of it this whole race. Rob, you had mentioned earlier, had Piastri not served that penalty, you could see he was just outside that top 3, and McLaren could have easily had a double podium. Now that we're 2 races into this upgraded MCL 38, it feels like McLaren are making early season magic with their upgrades again. And last year, this was the point where if you invested in McLaren early, you were getting lots of cost cap changes, big point differentials. So I think they're going to be really popular moving forward.
Yeah, 100%. I think Lando and Oscar are probably to me at least, the most proficient fantasy duo on the radar at the moment, if we're looking at constructors alone. And as you said, I think they were the best shout for a podium before Oscar got that grid penalty. I wonder if it's going to be quite as obvious as a track like Monaco, which is particularly difficult in and of itself. But I do think that if those upgrade packages, which really look to have served them well in the last 2 races, and Oscar Piastri in particular looked really looked like a really decent shot for a podium in Miami until his race was ruined. And I definitely thought it was a similar case in Imola. So, all it takes at Monaco in particular is one good qualifying lap to put you on pole or close to. And I think right now McLaren is my pick. But I think fantasy-wise, McLaren's annual surge becomes Red Bull's fantasy purge, and I wonder if people are going to be moving off the Red Bull constructor heading into the Monaco weekend if Perez's woes continue.
I totally agree. All of the future of McLaren hinges on whether Checo is in that mid-season swoon again, because the popularity of the Red Bull constructor and McLaren constructors, I think, are going to be interlocked for the next few weeks. So let's talk about what we do now with these three assets. For Lando, he just graduated into the Tier A price class, which means those price gains aren't going to be as good as they had been. But if he's competing for race wins and getting the Driver of the Day award, he could compete with Max. So I like Lando as a 2x alternative to Max. And then for Oscar, I'm not quite sure for most of our budgets that we can afford Oscar and another good driver. It's hard to find another good 2x driver that can sum to what a Max or Lando can do. But I love McLaren moving forward. You had mentioned earlier only 16% owned, and they cost 4.3 million less than Red Bull. So that allows you to upgrade those midfield drivers and really run a strong team.
Yeah, definitely. And particularly with Verstappen's qualifying performance lately, maybe a Verstappen, Ferrari, McLaren meta lineup becomes a popular pick moving forward.
I totally agree. And Rob, you mentioned a moment ago this showdown between Red Bull and McLaren. All bets are off once you get to Monaco because this is such a unique circuit. For 2 seasons in a row, you can see here that Monaco has ranked dead last in overtakes. And last year we had Checo leading the grid in overtakes entering this race, qualified last at this circuit. We thought he was going to cash in with a ton of overtakes, but only got up to P16. So even for overtaking experts, this isn't a sure thing at all.
No, not at all. I think it really and squarely places the emphasis on those stronger qualifying performers. And I mentioned Verstappen, he's got 7 pole positions in a row this season, a great standout. We know how fast Leclerc is over a single lap. And then if we're going a little bit further down the order, the drivers that stick out to me the most is Nico Hülkenberg and Yuki Tsunoda. Hülkenberg, I think, has had 4 out of 7 Q3 appearances and Yuki 5 out of 7. So those are the guys to me that stick out as the best value assets in that under 10 million price bracket. And if they can continue to deliver on that kind of theme from what we've seen so far this season, they're probably going to delivering the points even if they're going to be much lower than usual, and as a result you'd think price gain would follow too.
Looking back at 2023, 7 of the top 10 on the starting grid finished where they started. So if you can get a Hülkenberg or Tsunoda into the top 10, I think it bodes really well for them. So now that we know that there aren't many overtakes at this course, I want to direct your attention to the FanAmp pick of the week question, which is, will the qualifier who finishes P1 win the Grand Prix on Sunday? I have every reason to believe that they will because the last few years have been very predictable. Rob, what do you think?
I'm very much aligned with you there, Adam. I think the pole sitter will go on to win. You'd have to see something pretty out of the ordinary to see a result where P1 doesn't take it out. But I think if we're thinking of names off the top of my head, Max Verstappen, he's got pole in every single race so far this season. But if it's not Verstappen, I'd like to throw in Leclerc as a smoky pick to potentially take that out. So very curious to see what qualifying unfolds, particularly after Verstappen's incredible qualifying in Q3 last year to take that provisional pole result away from Fernando.
Since this track doesn't give us a lot of overtakes, what do we do if a top driver starts this race at the bottom of the grid? And you can see in that last slide that there's some rain potentially in the forecast earlier in the week. You have some midfield drivers that qualify high, so we could get a weird grid order. That's where I think we should start thinking about the final fix, Rob. We don't often plan for it, but we saw some pretty big swings from this chip last year. We mentioned Perez's P20 start, but if you subbed in Esteban Ocon, who lined up P3, you would have netted 22 points. So that's how important the final fix is. If you find an out-of-place qualifying result, the final fix basically cements them into their final result because there are very few movements in the Grand Prix.
I very much applied that approach in Monaco last year, which was where I did use the final fix chip. I, in fact, moved out Perez in favour of Carlos Sainz, who qualified in P4, and I thought Ferrari looked at that point quite good and might have just been enough to overtake the Alpine further up ahead. Wasn't to be. Sainz actually spun out throughout the race in I think it was Sector 1 and put any kind of hopes to bed as to what I was hoping would be an impactful result on the chip. I think I came away with net 0 from using that. So a pretty disastrous outcome from the final fix for me. But I think, as you say, if you can pick the right asset that ultimately gets close to a podium or something like that, and we end up moving away from a driver that we would otherwise expect a good qualifying from, then I think it can certainly turn into anywhere between 10 and 20 points if you've timed it correctly. The only other case I would make for maybe not using it in Monaco is a situation where we saw with Carlos Sainz in Qatar last year, where he has something, or a driver has something like a fuel leak issue, and they don't end up starting the race between qualifying and the Grand Prix. So it is something just to keep in mind, and I'd need to see something pretty significant like a Perez penalty or whatever asset or driver I own that suffers that fate in qualifying to go in that direction. Otherwise, I'm probably just going to hold it until a situation like the Sainz fuel leak issue arises, and just in that case use it, because I think it's better than getting a -20 for a not classified race result.
And it's a great reason to follow our socials, Rob, because you and I will definitely put up the red alert if we throw down the final fix chip in case anybody missed anything from the earlier sessions. And just some reminders on the final fix, you have to be able to afford the driver you bring in. So in my case, I have Max and 4 of the 5 cheapest drivers on the grid. That means if I use final fix this week and keep that lineup, I either need to sub the best driver on the grid, or I can't really afford anything. So also setting up your team to be in a position to afford somebody in the midfield is important to using it. One last thing on the final fix is that the driver you took out comes back onto your team at the end of the week for the sake of price changes and to start the next race. So be aware of that.
Yeah, no constructor use, unfortunately, for the final fix. And I think as well, as you said, if it is the most expensive driver like a Max Verstappen and you've got the 2x on him, the driver that comes in ultimately has their points multiplied on the race as well. So lots to think about, and I certainly think it's one of the most pivotal races where final fix does become a factor here.
Rob, I want to talk to you now about my head-to-head matchup with Laura WIN-ter, because back in China, I challenged Laura to a fantasy face-off comparing my team to Winter Wonderland, but we ran the same team in China and the same team and chips in Miami, so it all came down to this race, and Laura made 3 huge moves. She brought in K-Mag and McLaren and moved away from Alex Albon, and I kept him. So she beat me fair and square this week, and Laura, congratulations. You really are a fantasy expert. I'm so excited to see how you fare in the rest of the F1 Live League, because you are killing it right now.
She's absolutely blown away the competition. I don't think anyone behind her, the likes of Will Buxton, Chris McCarthy, seem to have the measure of Laura at the moment. So really looking forward to seeing her continue to build on this momentum into the rest of the season, because she's had an absolutely blockbuster start through 7 races.
I'll be posting all of my loser posts across my socials when this video drops on Tuesday, and I've also sent Laura a link to 5th Gear Garm so she can pick her prize too. So I'm coming true on my side of the bet. Rob, let's jump into our 3 teams for 3 budgets. I think there's going to be so much spread coming out of Imola that we should really cover all bases here. This first team in the cheapest price tier of 106 is a McLaren build with Lando, K-Mag, and Stroll. So you've got some budget builders and also some high points upside guys. And I can also see now that Lando's in price tier A, you could move in a Ferrari driver to really maximize your budget build so that you can try to get more expensive lineups. But I think for lower budget teams, this is a good start.
Yeah, I really like it. I think there's obviously a slight compromise you're making on Red Bull, but I think given the state of budgets at that price and availability of certain assets at that price, you've probably just got to make do with what you've got. I really love the McLaren coverage. Lando's in a rich vein of form at the moment. You mentioned the budget builders in Stroll and Hülkenberg, that even though Hulk went down 0.1 after Imola, has been a typically reliable source of price gain through this season so far. And Stroll, if he can just continue to string together some consistent results, he's usually good for a 0.5 million price increase at most when he doesn't DNF. But that, again, he's had 2 of those this season, so it's very much kind of potluck when you come to owning Lance Stroll. And then I suppose Valtteri Bottas and Sargent, the 2 most affordable assets in the game, round out the rest of the team, which I think at that price you probably have to account for as assets in your team, unless of course you're taking haircuts elsewhere.
Now moving on to the second team, I bumped this range up to 111 million because I know so many of you gained a ton of price at Imola last week. So this is a team I mentioned a moment ago. This is exactly where my price range is with Max, McLaren, and Ferrari. So you're hedging Max with the McLaren constructor in case something were to happen to Lando. And then you're using that extra budget from going from Red Bull to McLaren with just upgrading all of those midfield drivers. You're going from double Sauber into double Haas, bringing in Yuki. So a lot of what Rob had mentioned earlier, these drivers that can finish potentially in the top 10 and get a surprise finish at this track on Sunday.
Yeah, I'm very much entertaining a lineup like this. I think, pretty much 111 on the nose or close to that. So I very much like, for not just Monaco, but the races moving forward, the balance of the assets aside from Max, McLaren, and Ferrari. I think if you're looking at a track like Monaco, you've got those great qualifiers in Verstappen, Hülkenberg, and Tsunoda. And then for the races moving forward, where there's more kind of opportunity to overtake and gain positions, Zhou has typically a Q1 exit. Magnussen, we know, has gone up in price, I think, almost the most of any asset in the game. And so I really like those two drivers to kind of even out the high qualifiers. And then you've got McLaren and Ferrari. If Perez continues to struggle, I think they're going to be the pick of the bunch as the duo to run moving forward.
Absolutely. It also leaves you a little bit of financial flexibility in the midfield. If, say, an Alpine or one of those other midfield drivers has a surprise qualifying, you could use the final fix to make that last-second move.
Certainly.
On this third team, I want to show you what 115 million can get you because some people are there, and it allows you to run Red Bull and triple Ferrari. This thing is a beast. So this is part of why so many fantasy strategists are investing in boosting their cost cap this early in the season, because you can afford an absolute monster. This allows you to run the autopilot chip with some good options. It allows you to run the 3x DRS boost because you have a good 2x driver in there. I love this team.
Yeah, it's fantastic, very top heavy, and I suppose you're getting the best of Ferrari. As long as Sainz and Leclerc can continue to deliver their consistency, that's going to deliver you not just a good points result, but also some nice budget gain there too. I like the Red Bull for the Max Verstappen coverage, and you could certainly pivot if you wanted to out of the Ferrari constructor into McLaren as an alternative. That would probably mean making some compromises elsewhere, but I think at the same time, for what you've got, a pretty good hard-hitting lineup. Sargent, the one glaring deficiency, but I think that's the one small compromise you'd need to make to get in triple Ferrari, which I think for most people, the pros outweigh the cons.
Absolutely. And as always, let us know in the comments if our budget ranges don't match some of the things that you're looking out for. We can expand or contract the range to make this useful for you in the weeks to come. Rob, let's move on now to the Fantasy Formula Live leaderboard. We had a slight shakeup in the leaders here. Team 1 is Greeny, and number 1 Paddock. Here I come, rising to the top of our league. And I want to talk about the top scoring team for this week, which is Cost Cap'n V3. They scored 305 points with the Limitless chip, picking the top 5 drivers and top 2 constructors. And I call this out because it's 51 fewer points than our underwhelming Limitless team in Miami. And there was some chatter after Miami about potentially sprints not being the best place to run that chip, but after seeing this result, I'm not totally sold yet.
Yeah, it's an interesting approach. I think if it works well on those non-sprint weekends, it could really kind of pay off. But again, I'm not so sure yet if that's the variation we want to see. I think if we're looking back at the number 1 leader, Team 1 Greeny, they've got 18 points up on second place. So that's a nice little buffer they've already built out, which is probably worth 1 DNF worth of points right there. So a great little start there. I know we've talked about the importance of saving some of our chips for later in the season, which I understand most people in the top 10 will have already used. So I definitely think the gap to the top guys will have closed, but at the same time, certainly think that it's not taking anything away from their fast starts. So they've set the benchmark and the pace for a reason, and I guess we've got to catch up.
Kudos to those top teams. Rob, we are back again this Saturday, 1 hour before qualifying at 9 a.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. BST for our live show. This was the show last week where Terry boldly predicted that Max Verstappen would rebound after a difficult Friday, and he delivered. So we'll see what pearls of wisdom Terry can bring us this weekend.
Yeah, looking forward to it. It's going to be another great race at one of the oldest tracks on the calendar. So it's going to be a fun one. It may not be the most blockbuster, exciting weekend, particularly after the snooze fest that I thought was Imola, but notwithstanding that, Charles Leclerc's home race, and as a Ferrari fan, I couldn't be more excited. So fingers crossed, a good result for him.
Thank you everyone for watching. We'll see you on Saturday.